Hello and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffitt, and today I'd like to present the latest episode in my TV and movie review series, Hauntology and Dystopia. Now, today I'm joined by a colleague and a longtime friend, James Rose, who knows a
Hello.
great deal about these sorts of things. James and I previously did an episode based around the early works of David Cronenberg. You'll find a link to that on the website page for this. Now, today, James and I are going to be discussing George A. Romero's 1973 movie, The Crazies. That's my original DVD copy there. Before we dive into that, I'll get James just to introduce himself and tell you a little bit about his work, his career in films, TV, writing, criticism, etc.
Hello. Thank you for having me back on. It's good to be back on. I'm James Rose. I'm an independent academic or scholar who's a specialist in horror cinema and science fiction cinema. Now, obviously, there's a bit of a crossover there, and George Romero is a perfect example of that. I predominantly write about British horror films and more recently about Indigenous American and First Nations horror cinema, which may come up in this because there's a number of zombie films in that sort of area of film production. I write predominantly for magazines and journals and recently started writing for home entertainment releases as well. But I also write academic articles and academic chapters for edited collections that are international in their sort of scope. So it's quite a varied writing sort of platforms, but predominantly about horror films and a little bit about science fiction.
So, yeah, well, the Crazies, maybe we should say a word about when we both discovered this film or came upon it.
Mm.
I remember watching on VHS back in the 1980s, in particular Dawn of the Dead, Day of the Dead, which we would have got possibly under the counter from our local video store, depending on their rating at the time. Nothing particularly shocking about them, but video store owners, I guess, weren't supposed to be renting them out to young teens, as it were. And I thoroughly enjoyed those two films. Then later on television, caught Night of the Living Dead. And, Romero is not the most prolific filmmaker of all time, but what he contributed really to the zombie genre, as it were. I mean, it's just defined so much of it, really, his work.
Yeah.
But The Crazies was under my radar for a long time. And I don't think it was until, I mean, this is my Anchor Bay edition of the DVD. This is the first time it came out on DVD in the
Mhm.
UK, and I can't remember when that was. It was sometime in the 2000s.
Mm.
And I was probably reading a magazine article or perhaps a book, an anthology book, maybe in the 90s that I even discovered that this film existed. Of course, this was like pre-internet
Mhm.
and things have changed a lot. But as soon as I found out it existed, then I, of course, wanted to see it immediately, but it wasn't available. It was difficult to find, and you couldn't just go on YouTube. So I'm not quite sure when the first time I saw it was. It may have been this DVD when it first came out, say sometime in the 2000s. I'd have to look that up. And I could see it was an interesting thing in his canon as a sort of a interim or neither here nor there. It's not a zombie film per se, but it's this belongs in that Venn diagram makeup, doesn't it, of these types of
Yeah,
movies,
definitely.
of different types of overlap and what have you. But I was instantly impressed, but I could see how um however impressive it was, that more could have been done with it, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Looking at it again last night when I hadn't seen it for many years, it would definitely benefit from a remaster in sound and vision. I don't actually know if that's been done because I stuck with this original DVD issue, which I think is a very straightforward print
Mhm.
um, of the original movie. But we'll get into it in more detail. But yeah, let us know when you first heard about it and then managed to actually see it.
I think it was the same experience as you in that I kind of most of my initial sort of film knowledge came from two sources, either my dad or back in the day, the cinema section in the local library. And there was one book in the local library that was, I think it was called Fantastic Cinema by Peter Nichols, I think. And it had in it this strange midsection where it analysed key directors, and three of them were David Cronenberg, John Carpenter, and George Romero, which I think for the time is probably quite unusual, quite unique. We're talking about, mid 1980s, early 1990s here, so it's probably quite unusual for that to be there. And my dad was introducing me to lots of different films, most often John Carpenter stuff. So I sort of went through John Carpenter and found out about Cronenberg and Romero through him because they always seem to be like that book clustered together. And in that book, it listed all of Romero's films. And obviously, one of them was The Crazies. And I kept a sort of an eye out for it because at the time, like you're talking about renting VHSs, in my town where I lived at the weekend, there would be a local market. And not every week, but pretty much every week, there was a guy that would turn up and sell VHSs really cheap. And some of them were uncertificated, some were, some weren't. It was quite a mix. And I kept thinking, it will be there. I'll find it there amongst all this stuff. And I never did. But I did find, weirdly, as a comparison, David Cronenberg's Shivers, which probably shares some similarities with The Crazies. I never found it. And then, like you, I first discovered it in terms of watching it on that same DVD by Anchor Bay. And so much time had passed in between me wanting to see it as a young sort of teenager to being probably a 25, 30-year-old adult. There was something about that distance, and it didn't quite impact on me as much as perhaps it would have done. And I think that's because I'd seen the rest of Romero's work after it, before it, and knew what he would go on to do. So I think you're right. The film is almost three-quarters of the way there. And I think that's quite interesting. And it was also remade as well. You said about it being remastered. The Crazies was remade. I can't remember by who and when, but it was definitely remade. And I watched the remake, and it's quite good. To be quite fair, it's not that bad, but it's obviously set in our time period and perhaps doesn't have the political resonance that the Crazies does than the remake does. So interesting sort of way to begin a discussion about the film.
The remake was in 2010,
Mm,
and I did see it, and I remember enjoying it, but I haven't seen it since, and I did deliberately avoided watching it in the lead up to this because I didn't want this to become even inadvertently a comparison thing
yeah.
about the two movies, as it were. One thing I did remember about the 2010 remake was some of the press coverage and indeed fan reviews at the time saying, is this a rare example of a remake being better than the original? I can't
Mm,
really comment on that. I'd have to go back and watch it again. But I think we can safely say the general consensus was it was a decent remake,
yeah.
if not very decent, as it were. And that's refreshing, because one of the things that we've seen here we are a quarter of the way into the 21st century,
Mm,
but one thing I thought culturally that might happen in terms of music and movies and everything else, as we went from the 20th into 21st century, is that the nostalgia thing that seems to plague the sort of end of millennia, in
mm,
human society and culture would kind of get kicked away, and we'd be unleashed into like a fresh, and even if troubled, but a somewhat fresh and vibrant 21st
mm,
century. Oh, how wrong I was. And, the plague, if you pardon the pun, of like remakes and rehashes and reboots. And, it's stunning now, Hollywood in particular, some of the films that are being remade are just not that old,
yeah.
and almost nothing is sacred. I mean, there's so many directors and writers and people that you and I might have thought were immune from all of this that have got their work, as if they perhaps don't own the rights to, has been scooped up in this remake
Mhm.
hailstorm. So yeah, that's been kind of like, well, I can't even say it's disappointing. It just is kind of like depressingly predictable, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I can think of lots of remakes that or reboots or whatever that are very credible and very enjoyable. I mean, I certainly enjoy The Thing a lot more than Who Goes There.
Mhm. Yeah.
Whatever, it's the same basic story. So I'm not against that as such. But I think that something like, the remake of The Crazies is something that we say was credible and done probably for the right reasons, because you can't argue that The Crazies was such a huge box office success that they'd want to kind of, you know, cash in on that, which is what some remakes are about, isn't it? You know,
Yeah,
like, well,
yeah.
this film was successful first time around, so we'll try and do it again.
I think it's interesting as well that it's the Crazies that got remade, but also Romero's famous trilogy, Night of the Living Dead, got remade. In fact, it's been remade a number of times. Dawn of the Dead was remade by Zack Snyder, and then Day of the Dead got remade, and then got remade again. And it kind of it raises a question of these three films are considered to be quite, as you said in your introduction, very important pieces of cinema and at times pinnacles of the genre at certain time periods. They are only pinnacles of their time. That doesn't mean they're going to be successful 10, 15, 20, 25 years later. And while I quite like the remake of Dawn of the Dead, it hasn't got the political subtext, it hasn't got the power, it hasn't got the rawness that Romero's film has. And it's, I guess, the same with the Crazies remake. It's a polished film. And perhaps that's what a film like the Crazies needs. It needs to be polished. It needs to be perhaps filtered a little bit more in terms of presenting the ideas that the film contains to its audience, which are weirdly quite eerily apocalyptic given the things that have happened globally since its release.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's a rich mine of
Mm.
cultural comparison and science fiction becoming science fact and whatnot.
Mm.
In terms of like you were talking about cultural resonance of these movies at the time, um, a couple of the main protagonists in the Crazies are ex-military, and they're still talking about Nam.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
what I mean? But perhaps at this stage, I'm aware that if people are coming to this and they don't know anything about the movie, we should just say a word
yeah.
about the kind of the scenario.
Mhm.
So if anybody hasn't seen this movie and wants to see it, I'd like to think this would encourage them to do so. But
Mhm.
equally, if you stay with us until the end, there's probably a few plot spoilers. So we're looking basically, or do you want to set out the
Yeah, I don't mind
scenario?
explaining it.
Yeah, yeah.
The halfway through the film, we find out that a plane, a military plane, has crashed that's carrying what some of the military believe to be a sort of a basic toxin, something that isn't too worrying. But as the film progresses towards its end, we find out that it's actually quite a terrible virus. Trixie is its name, and it's quite tricksy in trying to sort of figure it
Mhm.
out and capture it and contain it in a space. But when the plane crashed, the virus or the toxin, whatever you'd like to call it, has leached into the local town's water supply. So slowly but surely, everyone's drinking that water and may or may not be drinking in some of Trixie and slowly going mad. But instead of just going mad and sort of crazy, they could become somewhat murderous. So the military is sent in to quarantine the town, which is called Evans, and try and contain the virus whilst trying to find a cure for the virus at the same time. But as I said, when we find out halfway through the film what's really going on, it becomes more and more apparent that it's very, very difficult to contain a virus that's waterborne and potentially airborne as well. So it's kind of a worst case sort of bioweapon gone wrong type scenario, which again, sort of as we said, feeds into sort of zombie cinema, science fiction cinema, and apocalypse cinema. So it's quite broad in its scope, but very contained in its narrative, which is simply a town going mad due to a military bioweapon.
Yeah, and at the first section of the movie, then we're dropped into this scenario, disorientating. You know, the audience is trying to figure out what's going on, and we see a family home being torn
Yeah.
apart by the father of the family, just apparently going insane and
Mhm.
smashing the house up, killing members of his own family, setting fire to the house.
Mhm.
And this, of course, sets the stage for like, what the hell's going on? And as you say, then at some point, the pieces begin to, in the kaleidoscope, the pieces begin to settle, and we see these people, these armed people in hazmat suits with gas masks. And this turns out this is the military response. So in some ways, we're dropped straight into a story that's been unfolding for some days or perhaps
Mhm.
even weeks.
It's 6 days, if I remember correctly.
Is it? Yeah.
The crash has taken place 6 days before we join the narrative as the audience. So you're right. It's the virus, the toxin, has taken hold at this point, and we're seeing it manifest, as you say, in quite a strong, quite graphic way of a father killing his family, which includes two small children, and it's quite shocking. It's quite brutal to see it happen.
Yeah, and then the initial involvement of the city is that in response to this house that's on fire, and the fire department are called out. But then that's at that point things start to be more complicated, and the firefighters and everyone else are trying to figure out, well, they keep talking about the army. What the army doing here? And it's like, you just never mind, you just get back to that fire. So it's an interesting one, when you sort of think that, for the firefighters' point of view, that this burning house and trying to get the family out of it is such a big deal. But then you zoom out and look at what's actually unfolding in, as you say, Evans City, and it's a classic case of the military kind of bioweapon accident. You can trace either an accident or deliberate deployment of a
Yeah,
bioweapon or whatever it is, or even chemical weapons, but particularly bioweapons, I think, because that then can interact with biology, with living creatures in a way that maybe chemical weapons or chemical agents don't. And there's so much of this, I think, in TV and movies that's come along since Romero. It'll be
yeah,
interesting to trace his influences in that, and to what extent he was using his own um, ideas or opinions about or reading of development of weapons like this, because it was something that really started to come along at the end of um, I know there were chemical agents being used in the First World War, but particularly after the Second World War, bioweapons started to become a big area of development. That's why there were so many UN and other bits of legislation, international legislation, trying to limit or prohibit the development of these things, because they realized where this could go
yeah.
and how disastrous it could be. So it's just one of many ways that that I think that Romero kind of you can trace so many things back to his work. And I think if we take the zombie thing aside, then in terms of the military dimension, and particularly for me, in certainly in his zombie films, yeah, particularly Day of the Dead, which I know that you were discussing, as you say, in another podcast today, the clash of the military and the scientific
Yeah.
wings of all this, for me, that's very significant.
It is in both films. There's that sort of conflict of interest, really. What do the military want and what do the scientists want? They don't normally, well, in both films they seem to want the same thing, but in reality they are in constant sort of conflict. I think kind of what's interesting about the science point of view of both films are the characters in both the films that represent science. They're really quite helpless. They don't really know what to do, particularly in the Crazies. The lead scientist, he he's frustrated in the extreme, and he can't do what he needs to do because the military have set up so many barriers towards him solving the problem. And it's again the same in Day of the Dead, in that the military figure in that, particularly Rhodes, the captain, he wants results now because he wants a cure to the problem to save himself, not to save the people. And that's again, I suppose, the same with the Crazies, in that you get the impression the military are there to protect the civilians and there to protect the science community, but really it feels like they're there to just corral them until they can legitimately shoot them. And it's kind of, we see the scientists battle with the military, but nothing really comes of it, does it? Because neither of them can control something that is as virulent as a bioweapon or a chemical weapon. We won't talk about the ending yet, because the ending involves the scientist, doesn't it? And what happens to him. So perhaps it's best to leave that till a little bit later. But
Well, yeah, perhaps the end.
yeah, yeah, a good place to talk about the end is the end. Yeah, good point.
Well, yeah, I enjoyed the military and scientific tension in this film, as I say, which later comes out as in Day of the Dead. Not so much Dawn of the Dead, because I think that's more like a they're really just fighting for their lives at that point, aren't they?
Hmm.
The protagonists there, just literally trying to stay one step ahead.
Hmm.
Whereas in Day of the Dead, things have moved on a little bit. That, there isn't established facilities. They've got scientific facilities. They've got the military are more organized, as it were. Whereas in Dawn of the Dead, it's not quite the case. It's also interesting. I enjoy this clash because um, we often see movies, post-apocalyptic movies, whether it's of the zombie or plague variety or not, that focus they're very action oriented on a military response to this. And there, science is in there and in the mix, but quite often the scientific element are this sort of demonizes also that you caused this.
Yeah,
In the Crazies, it's interesting because the scientists are working for the military to make this thing,
yeah,
and then they're all trying to like mop up afterwards as the lead scientist remarks, some paraphrasing kind of in the Crazies, you got us to do this,
mm.
we're doing this for you, sort of thing. There's an interesting uh you see a a heavily militarized response to plague outbreak, for example, in 28 Days Later.
Hmm.
I know that you've seen the release of 20 Years Later, which I haven't seen yet. And so, but many of the films, because of how cinema's packaged these days and what the mass audience wants, action sells. And but I like when they bring in a little something like, however minor it might be, relatively speaking, in the Crazies, but something of a movie like, for example, The Andromeda Strain, where you get to slow things down a little bit and start to look at what's been dealt with here, from a scientific point of view, just from a thinking point of view. Let's just put the guns down for a minute and think about this. What is happening here? What has been done? What can be done? Because there are certain points, as you say, in the Crazies, the military and the scientific wings are kind of both at a loss. But in in some movies, it's kind of like of this type of this type of duality. Well, give the scientists a chance, and as you say, how frustrated the commander in Day of the Dead gets with the scientists. But again, then you look at the lead scientist in Day of the Dead, and he appears to be some kind of like Frankenstein type
Yeah,
actor. You know what I mean?
yeah.
Not very sympathetic. Neither are. There was like so many. There's so little to believe and so few people to root for in Day of the Dead. But I did like that element, and then the Crazies, actually rewatching it last night, it felt quite brief film because it's got so much in it. But I did really enjoy the bit where when the military were doing what they could do, and was just as you started to hit the limitations of what they were capable of, and the lead scientist saying, I cannot believe, I don't want to rag on you, Major, or whatever the guy's rank was, but I can't believe how shoddy this operation is, And even the guy, the military commander who's brought in, said, and they're like, why are you here? He said, well, I was available, you know. So it's very much a piecemeal response from the military, isn't it, to something?
It
They don't.
is very much so at the beginning. It feels disorganized. It looks disorganized, and the conflicts are there, and they're slowly burning away, and they're compounded by the security, the voice check that they all keep having to do because they're trying to keep it all under wraps and not leaking out of Evans. So you've got all of these different elements putting pressure on them, but I think there's a point where it tips and they essentially declare martial law, don't they? And
Mm.
the sheriff gets shot trying to prevent that and try and prevent the military from putting in martial law and taking all the weapons away. And I think from that point on, the military almost seem to have organized themselves knowing what they've got to do, which is essentially now we've got to shoot everyone and that's the only way we're going to stop this from jumping the boundary, the state line of Evans. But then that's sort of Romero all over. If we kind of look across his films, there's always a consistent distrust of the military. And we see that clearly in the Crazies. And we also see it very, very clearly in Day of the Dead when Rhodes and his men are just, I'm not quite sure how to describe it other than that they are so frustrated by their experience that they feel the only thing they can do is kill. That's it. just kill, be that kill the zombies or kill the scientists or the under their sort of charge inside the bunker that the film set in. But as the crazy scientist you mentioned earlier says in Day of the Dead, the zombies outnumber the humans. I think it's 400,000 to 1. So even the military might of weapons and destruction, it's not enough. And you kind of get that feeling in the Crazies, is that although the military is shooting innocent people or people that are sick, the sick people are still overwhelming the military. And it gets more and bleaker and bleaker as we move towards the end, particularly with what happens to the lead scientist. So I think, yeah, there's something quite interesting being said about the military and how it responds and how it tries to coordinate itself with something until it recognizes it can't provide the solution that it wants, which is, in this case, everybody either cured or everybody removed in one way or another from Evans.
Yeah, at one point the commander, realizing their predicament, just says, okay, you know, we hold the perimeter, we want the choppers up in the air,
Yeah,
and everybody, and I mean everybody, that no matter who they are, they get one warning shot.
that's it. That's what he
Yeah,
says. Yeah.
yeah, and that if they don't respond to that, you know, they don't stop and put their hands up and say, "Okay, I'm coming in," or if they don't, you know, fall to the ground giggling and drooling and
Mm.
obviously infected, then you shoot them. You know, and that's what starts to happen. And of course, when they try to implement this, you know, seizing all the firearms, this being the US, you know, everybody's armed to the teeth, even mostly hunting weapons. But
Mm.
you've also got these two guys in this breakaway group who managed to escape. You know, they're trying to round up the population. They managed to penetrate
Mm.
that dragnet, and two of the guys in that group are military vets, and they know exactly what they're doing. So that's a real game changer in their
Yeah.
fortunes, you know. So the group's made up of those two military vets, one of the guys, his wife who's pregnant,
Yeah.
and then the other father and daughter
Hmm.
team, who I can't quite remember what their role in the city was or the towns as townspeople, but that's that small group um, of five that break through. But then it's kind of too late for the military. The weapons are still out there. They haven't had time to do what they needed to do. And this hot war has kicked off.
Mm.
And there's that innate distrust of the military that then manifests. And of course, it's a bit like at some point, I remember thinking, this reminds me of Red Dawn,
Yeah.
because this is quite a scattered community. Communication is not that great. They got some people have got telephones, some people don't. All they see are these guys rocking up that don't look like US military. They don't know who they are. They got these full bodysuits on, gas masks, and they're shooting, you know?
Mm.
And what I think at one point somebody's saying, you know, is this a war? Or that's certainly what they're meaning by what their reaction. And they say, I'm not taking no chances. And when they're still trying to drag people out of their homes, which you see the military doing up to a certain point, but at some
Yeah.
point they're like, you ain't taking me nowhere. And they start shooting the army,
But
you
that
know?
sort of punctuates the film near after the halfway mark. Romero just cuts to those moments, doesn't he, where it's just sort of like there's like a farmstead, isn't there, where the father is smashed out a window and he's shooting at these, like you say, these men in hazmat suits and gas masks, these rather faceless, frightening figures that are all in white against this American pastoral, which is all green and blue. And it's kind of, we're cutting backwards and forwards between the main action and that cutaway group, but also this very steady decline, not just of the sanity of the people of Evans, but the decline of the military as well in how they're responding. They're kind of, like you said, they're just killing people. They massacre one family at one point, don't they? They go into another farmhouse, and that's the famous bit, isn't it, where one of them gets the knitting needle in his chest, but
Mm.
they all end up dead. And it's kind of like they are systematically working their way through Evans, just killing anybody that they encounter. And it's pretty grim, but it also has to be said that the military do take quite a number of losses, don't they? We don't The military isn't framed as some all-powerful force. There are soldiers getting shot left, right, and centre. And there's that one that's sort of shell shocked somewhere near the beginning, and he says, "What do I do?" why am I shooting? Who's shooting who? And then he gets his brains blown out
Mm,
because he's just stood in the crossfire. So there's quite a lot of, although the military know what they want to do, there's an uncertainty on the ground what they should be doing and the moral value of what they're doing. So it's quite complicated. And I think we also should mention that quite early on, they also put a nuclear weapon on a plane, don't they, and have it flying over
mm.
Evans. Should it get to it, they'll just drop a tactical nuclear weapon on Evans. And one assumes not only kill everybody in Evans, but also kill the military personnel that are there, because arguably they too could be infected as well at this point. So it's Romero layering on and layering on and layering on the pressure and the stress really of the film.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we can touch upon that nuclear scheme again as a way of, an ultimate way of trying to deal with it. I don't think in the real world that necessarily would have washed. I mean, I know when the guys at the Pentagon or wherever were discussing this with the president, it was kind of like, well, we'll tell them that the plane crashed with some nuclear weapons on board,
Mm.
and some of our guys went in to deal with the weapons, and one of them went off. Well, it's not a hand grenade. You know what I mean? Nuclear weapons don't just go off. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, careful now. So how that would have washed, who knows? But yeah, regarding the military, that kind of degenerating as well, not clearly understanding their mission. This is partly um, an artifact of all the last minute, they've just been thrown into this and not really knowing what's going on. And like I say, I mentioned earlier, the commander, he's drafted in because he just happens to be available. At one point, we see some soldiers hold up in a house, rural house, and their plan is one of the guys says, "We just hold up here and wait for it to
Yeah.
pass." So they're going to stay there, batten down the hatches, and just come out, when things have blown over. So they're just as happy to sit it out as it were. They don't want to be part of this thing that they don't really understand. They, however, end up being killed by this band, as I mentioned, of
Mm.
the five townspeople who do manage to break through the cordon, that original dragnet. And I suppose in many ways it's their fortunes that we follow, isn't it?
Yeah,
As they try and survive what's going on. One of them I mentioned earlier, maybe that was off air, but there's a father and daughter duo,
yeah.
and this young girl, well, sort of young woman, that from the outset appears to be infected because she's kind of, exhibiting this erratic behavior.
She's an interesting sort of figure, isn't she? Because the group all sort of recognize that she's infected, but they take her along anyway, don't they? There's this kind of idea, in a way, about preserving the society, isn't it? Because we've got the young man and the young girl, a father figure, a father to be, and a nurse who's his. I can't remember whether they're married or if they're going to get married,
Mm,
but there's all of the elements of a new world order, a survival sort of scenario that should it all go badly wrong, you've at least got this core group of people that can re-establish society. And it's almost as if, particularly in the death of the girl that we're talking about, the daughter, it's almost like Romero revels in the fact that he systematically kills that family off, just like he did at the beginning. He
mm,
deliberately puts them into situations where they're going to get killed. And the girl that we're talking about, when she goes properly loopy, the soldiers don't quite know what to do with her. She dances around them and sort of says strange things to them, and they just shoot her. And it's
mm.
cold and it's horrific. And her death is fabulous because she just basically goes, oh, and falls over. There's nothing spectacular about it. It's just another death amongst all the other death that we've seen. And even though we feel for her and we connect with her, it's still it's a mundane moment in quite a horrific sort of scenario. But she's certainly an interesting character, and how those that are perceived to be not infected are willing to protect her, even though she clearly is infected.
Yeah, because it's not the infection itself. I mean, there's no signs of, like vomiting or,
Mm,
breakout of, flesh, the outbreak of some kind of skin disease or anything like that. There's nothing outward that you go, this is disease. It's more like a psychiatric thing, even though it's probably not. Um, that's, it doesn't manifest in anything that you would say, oh, I just want to get away from this person. It's
Mm.
just their behavior starts to change,
Yeah.
which again can happen to anybody really. It doesn't have to be as a result of disease. So and it's because it varies so much between individuals as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it's interesting as well how it's the small moments that slowly reveal themselves. So the nurse who's also pregnant, we slowly begin to realize that she may well be infected as well. And we know this to an extent because right at the beginning we see her drink a glass of water, but we're not sure where the source of the water's come from. Has it come from the main supply, which Trix is in, or is it a separate supply because it's an isolated house? So we're not sure. She's also, I think, taken the antibodies that the military seem to be constantly injecting themselves with. But so when she slowly starts to exhibit strange behavior, you start to think, is she cracking up because of the pressure of the situation, or is she actually ill with the virus and she's slowly going mad? And Romero teases that out the same as he does with the daughter figure. He pulls it and pulls it and pulls it for as long as he can, leaving us in that state of what's going to happen. What they're supposed to be the future. They're supposed to be the society that survives. So what if she is ill? What does that mean for the baby? What does that mean for the husband and the father? It raises all sorts of questions, which of course, in true Romero fashion, get answered in one very sort of blunt way. But again, yeah, it's a virus that makes us think. It makes us question what's going on and who's who and why they're behaving like that in that situation.
And of course, people might be thinking, well, this is set in small town um, USA, not near any big population center. Evans City is a little, I think about 3,100 people, something like that. Um, so what if they all die, not, callously, but just from a global perspective? But the whole point is that uh, this thing, it can, whether it's airborne or waterborne or both, could spread across the entire main landmass of the USA, of North America, in no time. Again, because it's not immediately obvious what's going on, and
Mm.
everyone's got to drink water, everyone's got to breathe air. And by extension, right across the whole world, it might not be the end of the human race, but could be a hell of a lot worse than 3,000 people dead.
Mm.
So what you're saying really in this scenario, the contained scenario, is like, it's just a microcosm of what could happen, in the same way that, well, it immediately springs to mind a film I haven't analyzed yet in this series, but like John Carpenter's The Thing. They're isolated
Mhm.
in that movie on our Antarctica, but if all of that had taken place in New York or London, you know what I mean,
Yeah.
or Tokyo, it could have been very different very quickly. So, and I think this may be something that the Crazies kind of understates in a way that would be laid on more thickly in a modern version, and probably was in the 2010 remake, which is just like the implications. It might have been spelled out more, simply, more explicitly. If they don't get a lid on this, what could happen? For me, in the Crazies, it's a little bit, maybe just a film of its time, in the early 70s, a little bit more left to the imagination. I mean, it's all
Mm.
there, but you kind of have to piece it together yourself. You don't have this exposition from characters just saying, well, gee, this thing could go global in 24 hours. You're left to work these things out, you know what I mean? Because it's pretty
I think
obvious.
it is like that, isn't it? And there's only one sort of verbalization of it is that there's a line, something along the lines of it could jump the state line, it could jump the boundary that we're setting up. We haven't, we can't rule that out, and that's it. We're left to see it. But you're right, that whole notion of the film is a microcosm of what would happen and how institutions that we believe are put into place to protect us might actually turn on us and get rid of us in order to save, but what? that's the question. And Day of the Dead asks that question again. Everyone's frantically trying to find a cure, but for what? We at the beginning of that film, it's made pretty clear the people that we're engaged with in the narrative are the only survivors. There's nobody for 100 miles either way of them. So it's the same with the Crazies. What's left to protect if you're killing all of the people? You're just left with two institutions, science and the military. And as the Crazies shows, they can't get on. So there's something quite frightening about that scenario, I think. And it's like we said earlier, Romero's distrust of the military and the distrust of governmental sort of agencies, and whether or not they're there to protect us or whether they're there to protect something that is abstract to us. And it's that, I think, is the undercurrent of fear. I was just looking through my notes, and one of the things that just stuck out to me is it says, one of the quotes is, "The army ain't anybody's friend," which is quite pertinent to what we're saying. And one soldier says to another, "You do it because you're told to do it." And that kind of tallies back to what you're saying about those other soldiers that are just going to try and sit it out and, keep their heads down and avoid it all. I think as well, in that, when you were talking about it, it reminded me that some of the soldiers are stealing money and jewelry and things like that. They're pillaging the bodies that they've just shot. So whilst there's martial law and a seeming control going on, there's an uncontrollability within the military itself. It's all sort of folding in on itself and keeps leading back to that distrust of Romero's distrust of the military.
Oh yeah, there's at one point, the order is given to burn all the bodies, of the dead, whether because they don't know who's infected or not. If you shot someone who appeared to be uninfected, but simply because they're waving a gun in your face, well, burn that body anyway. You don't know. And as you say, there's a very disturbing scene where there's a big pile of bodies, and you've got one group of soldiers taking all the personal effects from the bodies, watches, jewelry, wallets, looking through the wallets, going, "Oh, we got 100 here," and stuff like this. And then the bodies are put in a pile, and there's a guy with a flamethrower just going and moving up and down each body, and I was immediately reminded of just like, Third Reich, what happened with, the gold teeth and all that horrendous, that nightmare. Obviously this is like not on that scale, but the point is, it's just how thin the veneer is between order and chaos, even with something so apparently highly ordered and controlled as the military. You see what I mean? And then also you can apply that to the scientific community, if not the scientific, the activities of scientists, but their minds and how organized and controlled they're supposed to be.
That's the point of kind of the Crazies as well, isn't it? And the same with Night of the Living Dead, which is, some possibly could say that the Crazies is a reworked version of Night of the Living Dead. Is that we're living lives that we believe are in control. We believe that we're all following a pattern and a process. We go about our daily business. We're aware that we're being looked after and that institutions look after us. But it just takes one small thing and it crumbles very, very quickly. And like you said, it's an incredibly thin veneer between, I suppose in the Crazies terms, sanity and insanity. There's that flipping over between the two. But that uncontrollability is there all the time. It made me think about the scene where the soldiers in the hazmat suits and gas masks are walking along in a line through the field, and suddenly just this group of people appear and they're engaged in quite close combat, shooting each other. And it's not clear whether the people that are attacking the soldiers are normal and sane and defending themselves, or whether they're crazy. And it's just this gunfight and everybody takes losses. But in the background, we can see a woman with a broom sweeping up the grass. So the one crazy person doesn't get shot, and she isn't involved in the conflict. And when everybody's dead because they kill each other, this crazy lady, quite literally, comes along with her broom and starts trying to sweep up the bodies. And it's just like, that is it. That is the insanity of what the military have created, because they created Trixie. they've let it crash. They're trying to contain it. They're trying to contain it in a quite a brutal way, and it doesn't play out.
Well, when we if you remember the COVID-19 period that we all lived through, one little side issue there was literally, was it a single virus, or what was the origin of it? And when you had the lab leak theory, which was doing the rounds, that this was actually not a military thing, but it was like it came out of a scientific lab where they were doing gain of function testing, trying to make viruses more virulent and stuff. And all I can remember thinking was like, why? No, seriously, like, see, what is the are you trying to make food products that have a longer shelf life or something? What are you doing this for? Because if is it just because it's interesting? You know, I'm reminded of that Doctor Who
Yeah.
episode. It was with Tom Baker, and I can't remember which Dalek story cycle it was, but you or some viewers might remember this, but Tom Baker as the Doctor is having a one-on-one conversation with Davros, and uh, the Doctor's trying to reason with Davros, who's obviously like a sort of a thinly disguised, Nazi megalomaniac type. And he said, if you had between your thumb and forefinger a vial of whatever, toxin, poison, whatever, a virus, and if you broke that and released that into the world, it would kill all living things. Would you do it? I think he's just trying to push his
Mm,
limits.
mm,
And Davros is going, yes, yes, I would do it. Ah! Screen roll credits, that sort of thing. So the whole military agenda of this sort of thing, I understand why they're trying to develop what they're trying to do in these situations is trying to develop weapons like the nuclear weapon was intended to be, like a weapon that cannot be used.
yeah.
But the problem with nuclear weapons to an extent in terms of like the materials that go into making them, but particularly chemical agents and bacteriological agents, is a whole different world opening up there. And they're
Mm,
literally messing with forces they don't really
mm,
understand. And it only takes one tiny little mistake and you're into major problems. So let's entertain the idea just for a moment that what happened during the pandemic period in the real world, a few years ago, was a result of like a lab leak. Well, look how badly that went. And even if it
mm,
wasn't, we are talking about fiction where these things happen, and they're not based on total fantasy. They're based on plausible scenarios.
yeah.
Mm.
It's interesting because when we were talking about doing this, we said, how does it connect with the real world? And obviously for Romero, making it in the 70s, it's post-Vietnam. There's all of those issues there. There's the connection with the religious figure immolating himself with the famous photograph from the Vietnam era, the Vietnam protests. There's the distrust of the military. There's young military figures that have no idea what they're doing and they're getting shot and brought back in body bags. It's all there. But for us in hindsight, it's almost like a warning, isn't it, from the past, sort of saying, you do this, this is how quickly it will dissolve, how quickly it will all sort of fall apart, that society can't manage itself, it can't contain itself, it wants to rebel even though it know it shouldn't. And I think it's quite, I think with all us all having lived through that experience and then watching the Crazies, it's far more frightening watching it now than when we probably did when you said, when did you first experience it? When did you first encounter it? Because when you're watching it is a work of fiction. You just think, yeah, whoo, that's scary. But that's not going to happen because the people that we trust tell us they've put things in place. But then COVID happens and it's it's astronomical, isn't it? What happened, how quickly it happened, what things occurred, and how many people died, and all of the procedures that we put into place over that period of a year, 2 years. And Crazies just seems to sort of warn us that, like you said, we shouldn't meddle with these things really, because why do we need to do it? And again, that question comes up in Day of the Dead. We'd be given these connections that one of the scientists, Sarah, just keeps saying, what's the point? Why are we doing this? We don't need to remove the stomach of a zombie to prove that it will still want to eat human flesh. We don't need to do that. And the man that's done it, Logan, the one you talked about earlier, is just like, yeah, but he's just like, yeah, but let's do it anyway. Let's do it, and let's see the spectacle of it, and let's see where it goes. And even in that short sequence in the film, it goes wrong because the zombie that has had its stomach removed breaks free and attempts to eat one of the characters. So even in a microcosm scene, Romero's playing out that narrative that you've just talked about, constantly saying to the audience, why are these people doing this? Why are we allowing them to do this? Because it can only end one way. that is either someone gets eaten by a zombie, a plague is released, and innocent people are killed, or in the real world, it's accidentally released or intentionally released, whichever one, and lots and lots and lots of people will get killed. And again, you mentioned 28 days later. That's again that same microcosm, and 28 weeks later plays out that same scenario. One zombie escapes, everyone becomes infected, and we're just back to where we were. So I think it's quite a frightening scenario to talk about, and quite a frightening scenario to see in a film if you would take it on the value that perhaps Romero wants you to see it as, which is this is a warning. Don't let this happen.
Yeah, well, in 28 days later, you have that a couple of things sprung to mind there. One was when they've got that we'll call them zombie, but the infected.
Mm,
They do behave like you're more or less like your typical movie zombie in 28 days later. They're maybe not like flesh eating, but they're rabid, aren't they? Like just
mm,
tearing at people, and the way they move, their spasmodic movements. They have that infected person chained up the military doing their
yeah.
compound, don't they? Just
Mm,
to see what happens.
mm,
It's some kind of test just to see, can we learn anything about these creatures by just isolating one of them and just literally see what happens, a little bit like Bob,
yeah.
in Day of the Dead. And but also in 28 Days Later, there's that Christopher Eccleston's military commander, um, cool and in control, but you can see when the civilians are brought into the compound and he divulges a little bit, I think because he has to, he feels he has to. Um, he's got a lid on a simmering, soon to be potentially boiling over saucepan, hasn't he, really,
Yeah.
with his men? And they're already at the ragged edge, aren't they,
Mm,
of like being under control. And it's only really his sheer authority and their kind of, I suppose, respect for him that's keeping it together. If something
mm,
happened to him, they just turn into like wild men in the same
mm.
way that you could see that in the breakdown of the behavior of the military in Crazies. That little band that went rogue in that house decided to hole up. And in the shootouts with the civilians, it's just a Wild West type thing. Literally, it's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
people in the hazmat shooting at the people who has not hazmat suit.
Yeah. I think it's a recurrent sort of character in that crossover that I mentioned quite early on between horror and science fiction, that the military figure who's supposed to be in charge, their authority is paper thin. It's not even hanging in the balance anymore. We know through seeing that figure again and again and again, it's all going to go wrong, and that the men who are under their assumed authority are going to rebel, usually violently. And we see it in 28 Days Later, like you said. It's in Day of the Dead. We see that with Rhodes, and we see it again in the Crazies, in that although it's not as explicit, the man that's been drafted in thinks everything on the ground is going as it should. But in reality, he's got no idea what's going on. The reports that are coming back to him are in contrast to the orders that he gives. And the only one that's followed out is the one we mentioned earlier, that you fire one warning shot and then you shoot them. And it's almost giving the military sort of like carte blanche to just start shooting everyone, isn't it? Oh yeah, I shot at them once, so I gave them a warning, but now they're running at me, so I've got no choice but to shoot them. And it's that figure that we assume should be in charge and in control, but in reality they're not. they're just saying words that are meant to bring control, but they're not. And particularly one you mentioned, Chris Eccleston's character in 28 Days Later is a perfect example of it. He's just saying stuff because he knows
Yeah.
he knows it's just a matter of time. And like you said, the arrival of the civilians, or more accurately, the arrival of two female civilians,
Mm.
is what tips it over the edge. And again, like having talked about earlier about Day of the Dead in another podcast, that the the military in that, there are two figures, Steele and Rickles, that are fixated on the one woman, the female scientist Sarah, in the silo, in the bunker. And they do make a number of sexually violent comments towards her. But one thing that I kind of noticed about it was that even when they're not talking to her, but in the same room with her, their poses are very violently sexual. They put their machine guns in their crotches and they point them at her and things like that. There's all of this constant subtle layering of violence to come. And we know that's going to happen because we've got films like The Crazies that have told us we can't trust these people. They might just, Rhodes says, oh, they're just venting, they're just letting off steam. They're not. They're expressing verbally what they intend to do. And when we see it in The Crazies, it's going crazy. It's going crazy in another way. The normal people are sick with Trixie, whereas the military are crazed to a great extent in their own power, in their own firepower, in their own ability to shoot, kill, and get away with it. So it's quite a, I suppose we could say it's quite an anti-military film, to say the least.
Well, I mean, just as an aside, because it popped into my head, of course, one rich mine of discussion for the military scientific cooperation and then breakdown and confrontation is in the Alien franchise, isn't it, really?
Mm,
If you think about that.
yeah.
But as far as yeah, there's that, because of the military, you see, in peacetime, what do they really get to do? They train and they train and they train and they clean their guns and they polish their boots and they train some more, you know. Um, when do they ever really get to do anything they're trained for? And that's part of the issue is that sometimes when they're called to do that, that it's kind of like, oh, I never knew what it was like to kill a man, that type of
Mm,
thing. So there's that whole dimension of finally we get to do some of this, if you see what I mean. For some members of the military, it'll be not what they expected. It'll be difficult to deal with. It might even be like something they just realize they cannot do actually when it comes
mm,
down to it. For others, it'll be like, oh my God, this is actually I signed up for the wrong reasons, but now I get to blow people's heads off, and they take to it with great gusto. But as far as the relationship with females goes, particularly civilian, you have to kind of wonder what's going on. And it is for each film or story or scenario, there'll be different wrinkles to this, different dimensions. But in a survival scenario, say you're facing a kind of like a potentially not quite end of the world, but really an apocalyptic scenario, not just Evans City and the Crazies, but like just globally, like in 28 Days Later,
mm,
potentially, we're not quite sure the extent of the spread of that, but is it about a just wanting a female because the world's going to burn and I just want to have sex before I die type thing? Or is there something more primal about, well, this male female thing is going to become really important again
mm,
in terms of like they might not be thinking about this explicitly or really understand it, but it's in terms of procreation, in terms of maintaining the species. This is going to be significant, and there's always in any type of survival scenario, whether it's apocalyptic or not, when you get these smaller groups, there becomes this power play, doesn't there, quite often in amongst heterosexual members of the group, men for females, especially if there isn't one for one, if you
mm.
know what I mean. It becomes incredibly competitive. Because it confers status,
Yeah.
all sorts of things going on there. And of course, females in some of these stories understand this, you know.
Day of the Dead deals with it it asks the questions that you've asked, but it doesn't quite answer them in that Rickles and Steele just want to, I don't think, abuse Sarah. They just want to assault her. That's what they want to do. And there's a whole raft of reasons which we haven't got the time to sort of lay out, but there's a whole number of reasons why they'd want to do that. But in contrast, the figure of John, the helicopter pilot, who's a civilian, the same as Sarah, she's a civilian scientist. Keeps saying to her, "Why don't me, you, and Billy, the other sort of normal male civilian in the film, why don't we just get in the helicopter, fly away, land on a beach somewhere, an island, and just have babies?" And he sees it as a way of it's a way of starting society again. But he also puts a caveat in that he says that if that's what we do, if we fly away and we start population again, they're never ever coming back to the mainland. He doesn't want children of this new world order to ever know about the world that him, Sarah, and Billy grew up in and were born into and have survived. So he's got a very peculiar sort of notion about what the future should be and what reproduction should be. And that goes back to the Crazies, because one would assume in a film, a normal Hollywood film, American film, that the husband, the father, the mother, the wife who's pregnant will survive because they're the symbol of the future, aren't they? They're, in this context, a symbol of America carrying on. But that's just not the case in Romero's world. It's kind of like, no, that can't go on. And we see it in Night of the Living Dead as well. Tom and Judy, the young couple, they talk about a future. They're going to get through this zombie nightmare and they're going to get married. They're going to have children. No, they get blown to pieces in a truck. And what's left of them is consumed live on screen for us. And it's just kind of like, no, there's no future. There's not going to be any future. So you're just left with the savagery of these men who you say are desperate for alpha status. They're desperate to exert masculinity when that's not what's needed at the end of the world. Masculinity is the last thing we need. It's what Sarah says. We need cooperation. We need to put the old world order to one side and start to work towards a new world order. But the Crazies doesn't even get that far because the military are so anxious about what's happened that they may as well drop that nuclear weapon, mightn't they, really? Because they are just going around systematically killing people. I think it's also worth mentioning how at the very end, the military captain, the one who's just been brought in because he was available, walks away from the situation. He goes through all of these tests. They make sure he's immune or at least isn't infected, and he walks into a helicopter pad and flies away. He leaves the destruction, and one of the last things we see are all of his clothes being burnt, everything that he's touched being burnt, and he's just sort of like, okay, I'm going now to another city where we think Trixie might have shown up. So it's just bleak, isn't it? Just relentlessly bleak.
Well, it is because, as you say, he's been called away, and we hear as he's like getting his things together to leave, we hear the soundtrack is the call that was made to him from the higher ups, as it were, just going, listen, you've done a great job here, and we're not quite finished yet, but we're getting there, you know. So we know you're going to do the same great job at this new location. So yeah, you knock him dead, kid, you know.
But
He's
what
like,
has he achieved? It's not what have they achieved? They haven't found a cure. They haven't contained Evans City. They've lost numerous numbers of their own, as well as, you know, potentially half of the population of Evans City. What have they actually achieved? And that's why I think that that ending is him just like going, I'll just walk away from it then, and I'll let it just devolve because I've been given a get out of free card here. Because the president's just phoned me and said, "Oh, could you sort out the same problem in another state?" But we know he's not
yeah,
because they haven't solved it in Evans City.
yeah, you've knocked it out of the park there, mate. You know, so here's another one for you. You know,
Here's another one for you not to solve.
well,
Here's another one for you to not do it properly. And it's kind of it's unfair in a way to say it because that military guy, he seems trustworthy. He really genuinely wants it to work, and he tries to put everything into place. But by the end, he's just exasperated by the military machine. He's exasperated by the unpredictability of his men. He's exasperated by the civilians, and he's exasperated by the unpredictability of the virus itself. And he's almost like he's saying, I'm just going to have to watch this happen. I
Mm.
can't do any more than I have done. And that is in part because he doesn't know what that scientist who we talked about quite early on, he doesn't know what that scientist found out, and nobody does. So is
Yeah,
now time to reveal what he's done.
yeah, that was one of the bits, uh, scenes towards the end of the film when you realized, if you're watching it for the first time, that yeah, they're not going to work this out. Whether you're familiar with Romero's work or not, and what kind of trajectory, his story might take, when, as you say, the lead scientist who seems to have cracked it. He thinks, look, I think I've done it here. We've got to get these samples out of here just to confirm if I'm right or not. And then that doesn't happen, because because of military blunder.
Mm.
Again, they throw him in a room with all the crazy people, or they try to.
But I think there's also the thing about he won't tell that woman who's
Mm,
assistant, he won't tell her what he's discovered. And it's almost this sort of selfish notion of I've discovered it, I want the glory. I want the fame from this. I want to be the scientist that created Trixie, and I wanted to be the scientist that saved us from Trixie. It saved Evans City. It cured all of these people. And it's the way he kind of holds on to those vials of blood, those vials of the antidote, before he even gets into the craziness of what he has to walk through to try and get them out. There's just this feeling that I got was just like, why won't he tell her? It,
mm,
tell her so that the cure is known. It's not just within him and that sample of blood or the two samples of blood. So it just seems to me a bit, there's something about his masculinity, something about him being this male scientist that's got to win, that's got to find the cure. Whereas the other scientist, the female scientist, is working as equally hard as him, working as equally long hours as him, and just find the the connection that he has. So why not share it? And I think that's part of the depression, if you want to call it that, the misery, the bleakness of the ending is that Trixie had been cured, and his selfishness wouldn't allow the cure to be made. But there's a double ending, isn't there, with the guy as well, the Vietnam vet. There's another ending with him where his wife, the nurse, thinks he's naturally immune.
hmm
So he arrives, he gets captured, doesn't he, and brought into the compound.
mm.
And a soldier says, do you want him testing for immunity? And the scientist goes, nah, he's crazy. He's just one of them. And he gets scurried away. And there's that beautiful shot of that guy knowing A, he's not crazy, and B, he knows he's immune naturally and just doesn't say anything. There's all of this sort of almost bloody mindedness about not working together again and solving the problem.
Yeah, because he could have said, look, look at me. Do I look insane? I think you should
Mm.
test me. I've got this far. I'm not cracking up. I think you should test me. But he just doesn't. And I remember the first time I watched it, I was like, why doesn't he just say something? But then at that point, it's just not going that way, is it? And the vials of spilled blood, with the antidotes, those are smashed on the ground during that
Mm.
sort of almost like a riot. Crazy people are a bit like the hope that's dashed, with the nurse, this guy we were just talking about, his wife or soon to be wife who was pregnant, and she's shot. And then, and there's this bit at the end where it's like really heart-wrenching. She's saying the baby's kicking,
Yeah.
as she's lying there dying of gunshot wounds. But that, in a way, if that microcosm was writ larger, let's say she was let's think of more post-apocalyptic things, Children of Men or whatever, let's just say
Mm.
that's the last the pregnant woman on Earth or whatever, you know, and this is the future of the species is her unborn child, you know. So
But,
there's a lot, you know, there's a lot to think about in that.
but that's Romero again, isn't it?
Mm,
Laying on the not not the bleakness, although it obviously is. It's him layering on that notion of does if everyone had cooperated, if everyone had listened, and everybody worked together, this wouldn't have happened because she gets shot by mistake, doesn't she?
mm,
Those rednecks rock up and gung ho just shoot her. And even though he's saying no, no, it's me, I'm okay, no one's ill, even though he knows she's ill, he tries to protect her and they shoot her. But then one of them gets shot as well, don't they, by the military that are still hanging around. And it's like a just this barrage of death. And in it all, he's the sole survivor. And we know he's immune. But like you said, why doesn't he say? Why doesn't he say, I can save all these people? But he doesn't. And Romero leaves us with that. It's almost like a triple bleak ending, isn't it? The scientist is dead. The one immune person doesn't want to share it. And the commander that's tried to keep it all under control has literally just walked away and got a helicopter and
yeah.
flown away from it, which is a very similar ending to Dawn of the Dead
Mm.
and Day of the Dead. That the only run away is to get into a helicopter and run away. But what are you running to? And surely, whatever you're running away from, be it a zombie apocalypse or a viral outbreak, it is going to reach you. It's going to get to you at some point. So it's still pretty bleak. Whatever way you
Well,
look at it.
you know, I guess as we begin to bring the discussion to a close, we opened up talking about the sort of triumvirate of Romero, John Carpenter, David Cronenberg. One thing that the Crazies brought back to me again, and we've mentioned a few other films that fall into this category, is the kind of the not even just a lack of closure, but just of like an opening up potentially in the mind of the viewer of this, oh Jesus Christ. It's like things when you get back home from the cinema and you're just lying there staring at the ceiling, you know,
It's
thinking,
not
oh,
the evening entertainment I wanted.
oh my God. But this willingness to end a story, even if it's not the end of a story cycle, something may follow, you know, a sequel
Mm,
or whatever, some development of the characters. But just to end on that ambiguous note, the ultimate one for me, I think, is probably John Carpenter's The Thing. You know, let's just sit here for a while and see what
mm,
happens, type thing. And I've always appreciated that with filmmakers being willing to do that. It's this forced closure that I can't stand. You know, even 28
mm.
Days Later had two endings, didn't it? You know, Danny Boyle
Yeah,
was kind of coerced into or whatever,
yeah,
suggested he might like to film not a happy ending, but one that had kind of a bit of closure to it, you know,
yeah.
so people didn't go home and slit their wrists. But so yeah, so the Crazies once again, which we've been discussing, George Romero's 1973 piece, trying to get one there without the glare on it. Um, it's a great early example of a film that I saw with that ending. You're not even left hanging, but it's just there's so much to think about, and the willingness for a filmmaker to just almost unload more at the end of the film on the viewer than he has even
Yeah.
throughout the whole previous, you know, hour, 90 minutes or whatever.
It's certainly a slow burn in that respect, isn't it? Because we're with that breakaway group, the five that you mentioned, and there's there's always enough in the film to make us think one of them will survive, two of them will survive, three of them will survive. They'll get out and they'll tell the truth of what happened. Everything will be exposed, a cure will be found, and everything will be okay. But it just doesn't work that way. And like you said, near the end, it's just one death after another in sort of almost rapid succession, along with a few innocent people on the periphery of both the civilians and the military. And we know it's just completely and totally utterly out of hand and out of control. And that's the crazy is the feeling at the end is exactly the same as Romero's Night of the Living Dead, in that the sole survivor of that is mistaken as one of the zombies and shot. And it's just like, but no, he, he he knows what to do. He knows how to escape. He's survived the ordeal. He's equipped with knowledge now, and he's just shot from a distance. Even it's
Hmm.
not even something close and personal. It's just, oh, there's another one, bang, and the mindlessness of it amplifies characters in that film, Ben's death. And the deaths in the Crazies, just like you say, they reverberate after you've closed down the film. You've walked away from it, you've left the cinema, you've taken the DVD out, and their deaths are still there because they don't provide closure. They just instigate more and more and more questions in your head about what happens if this is real, or what would
Mm.
happen if this occurred, because it ain't going to end. It's not going to end like a Hollywood film, is it? It's just not.
No, I mean, in the early days of when things began to look serious with the COVID-19 situation. By that, I don't necessarily mean about, infections or deaths, but in terms of how people reacted to
Mm,
what they were hearing on the news, being in a supermarket, and that time when toilet roll suddenly became like gold,
yeah,
and watching, and I saw this happen. This elderly lady with just a couple of packs of toilet roll, just enough for, for her at home on an average shop, walking down an aisle, and a grown man coming the other way, middle-aged man, and grabbing one of the packs out of her trolley and putting it in his basket, just grabbing it. And then another guy, adult male, spotted this, came over and just remonstrated with him right in his face, took it out and gave it back to the old lady. And I remember thinking how easy it is, that we
yeah.
know
But
how.
that's exactly what you said earlier, isn't it? The veneer of
Mm,
civility, the veneer of control, the veneer of being polite to one another, respecting one another. It's paper thin, and when something that we perceive to be catastrophic, it just disappears, doesn't it? I mean, one of the first things that I saw when it all started was a police cordon across the main road near where I live, and they were checking people if they had a legitimate reason to be out, and it was it's kind of innocuous in some respects, but then you start to think, but that's a police barricade. That's the police stopping people. That's the police stopping everyone and wanting to know your business. And it was sort of like, this is it. This is the this is
mm,
the beginning. This is what you see in a film like The Crazies early on. Just something out of place, but not threatening. But in reality, that could escalate quite quickly. And, thankfully it didn't in our real world scenario. But in a film like Romero's sort of world, that could escalate to those police then get guns, those police get uncertain, those police start shooting people, and it escalates out. It's the same with the person picking out the toilet roll, isn't it?
mm.
What else are they going to do? If they're prepared to do that, what are they prepared to do when it slowly starts
Yeah,
to wake
if
you
it's
up?
down to like never mind something to wipe your butt with, what if it's like it's down to something to eat,
Yeah.
you know?
But that was the other thing, wasn't it? It wasn't just toilet rolls that were taken off the shelves, it was pasta. Everybody everybody wanted pasta. So suddenly everybody really desired pasta and rice. And
And
but
and
nothing else,
and
nothing else to go with it.
tin tomatoes. Do you remember that? Thing was, there was always more food than you could ever eat, but it
Mm,
might not be exactly what you wanted. So it was a good lesson in actually the abundance that we do live
mm,
with, and how there's, billions of people around the world who make do with a lot less
yeah.
type thing. So I think if nothing else, it was a good lesson, maybe thinking about that. But of course, if any lessons that were learned, I think were fairly swiftly forgotten in the aftermath, when we're back to more or less the same situation again. So,
Yeah, we forget those images, don't we? We forget those news reports. We forget those powerful sort of images which arguably could be easily slotted into a contemporary post-apocalyptic film and not be out of place.
mm,
They'd seamlessly blend into the fictional world that the writer and the director are trying to create and the actors performing. And it just, I don't know, those images should linger. They should remain in the cultural consciousness to remind us of lots of different things. And I guess that's the importance of things like the Crazies not just being made, but being resurrected again on DVD and being made available to us on Blu-ray or being available to us to stream, that we can see, what, without being too over the top about it, but these sort of messages from the past that sort of want to warn us about our present, they're all sort of, they're little capsules, aren't they, waiting to be opened and to be explored.
Exactly. So once again, in case anyone's forgotten, we've been talking about The Crazies, George Romero's 1973 movie. Before we sign off, James, let listeners know, viewers, I should say, on this occasion, where they can find your work, online, because you're a published author. You've written lots of articles. You've got all sorts of materials online. So if people want to look you up, so to speak, where can they find it?
If my first book, Beyond Hammer, is readily available through Liverpool University Press on Amazon and all sort of online retailers and physical bookstores, and that sort of looks at 10 key British horror films post 1970s and sort of explores British culture, just like we've been exploring culture today in this discussion. It just sort of tries to connect historic events with certain horror films and certain conditions in British sort of psyche. In terms of online content, it's all over the place, really. There's quite a bit of work on a site called Offscreen, which has got quite a varied sort of essays on there. I've just done a lot of work relatively recently for the Horror Homeroom, which has this really nice sort of concept where you choose one scene from a film, a horror film, and you analyze it to the nth degree. And it's really enjoyable to do as a writer and enjoyable to do as someone who enjoys horror films. But reading other people's stuff, you just start to really see the intensity of thinking that goes into filmmaking, not just horror films, but any sort of filmmaking. So the Horror Homeroom is a great place to have a look. Offscreen, Senses of Cinema, that's another place that my work can be found. So yeah, it's all over the place. Just if you Google my name and horror film, quite a bit comes up.
Well, once again, James, thank you so much for joining us today. And to all of you out there, my name's Greg Moffitt, and you've been watching LegalizeFreedom.com.
LegalizeFreedom.com